Thank you for everyone's presence this morning, online and also in person. Thank you for the opportunity to share something that is both academically meaningful and personal significant to me. As many of you know, my academic background is in theology, with a particular focus on systematic theology. And during my Masters of Divinity and Masters of Theology studies, I engaged intensively with the work of Martin Buber and Abraham Maslow. More recently, as you know, through my Masters of Psychospiritual Studies, I gained a deeper appreciation for the work of Carl Rogers. And at the same time, my experience as a spiritual care practitioner in a hospital setting has provided opportunities to witness the transformative potential of therapeutic and spiritual encounters in practice. As these various influences began to converge, I became increasingly interested in the relationship between spirituality, psychotherapy, and human flourishing. I found myself wondering what might emerge if Buber's understanding of encounter, Rogers' therapeutic conditions, and Maslow's vision of self-transcendence were brought into conversation with one another. This interest has ultimately led me to pursue my doctor's studies, where I hope to contribute to the growing field of spiritual integrated psychotherapy, and especially in the spiritual care context that I work in. In today's presentation, I will begin by exploring psychotherapy as a sacred encounter. From there, I will examine Martin Buber's concept of the I-thou relationship and its significance for understanding the spiritual dimension of encounter. I will then turn to Carl Rogers and consider how his person-centered approach may contribute to a reclaiming of the sacred within a therapeutic practice. This will lead us to an exploration of moments of sacred mutuality and their significance within a therapeutic relationship. This presentation will also engage with Abraham Maslow's understanding of self-transcendence, as well as the opportunities and challenges involved in integrating spirituality into clinical practice. Particularly attention will be given to spiritual assessment and the importance of spiritual care practitioners' own self-awareness. And finally, I will conclude by outlining my emerging argument regarding the central role of mutuality in a spiritual integrated psychotherapy, and by sharing several preliminary findings from a recent survey that informed this work. So let us begin with the psychotherapy as a sacred encounter. Psychotherapy is often described primarily as a clinical intervention focused on alleviating symptoms and modifying maladaptive behavior. However, I argue, such a framing obscures the deeper reality. Psychotherapy is fundamentally relational and exists within the human encounter. The therapeutic space can be a threshold where sacredness emerges, where the meeting of two persons invites a transformative recognition beyond the psychological domain. Psychotherapy, therefore, provides a platform for uncovering the unknown, the something more that lies beyond our immediate awareness. Through transforming patterns of experience and relating, psychotherapy has the potential to reshape one's world and identity, integrating what was once external into the very core of being. Psychotherapy provides a space in spiritual care where patients feel empowered to bring forth all aspects of themselves, confident that their deepest yearning will not be accepted but also explored with care and a lot of value. This view is echoed in the emerging field of SIP, Spiritual Integrated Psychotherapy, which is gaining traction in Ontario as a recognized therapeutic modality. SIP is more than an occasional inclusion of spiritual language of prayer. It is a comprehensive integration of the spiritual and psychological dimension in therapy. According to Dr. Smith and O'Connor, SIP welcomes the spiritual into the psychological and the psychological into the spiritual, offering a robust module of therapy in which spiritual assessment, goals, interventions, and outcome are given equal weight alongside psychological ones. This modality does not merely argument secular psychotherapy with spiritual elements, but begins from a premises that the human person is inherently spiritual and that the therapy should engage that dimension with ethical sensitivity and clinical skill. Ignoring this, according to the APA Ethics Code from 2017, may not only be unethically, but also lead to malpractice. Therefore, the practical question for clinicians is no longer whether to address the sacred in psychotherapy, but rather the question is when and how to address the sacred. Spiritual care practitioners do not just work with pathology. They enter into the complex, often sacred lived experience of others. In this way, SIP provides a critical framework for reclaiming the sacred within the clinical setting. SIP helps therapists and spiritual care providers engage with patients' spiritual identity, meaning-making processes, and experience of the sacred, whether these arise from religious traditions or personal beliefs. As Pargament and others argue, when spirituality is addressed appropriately in therapy, client outcomes, both psychological and spiritual, are significantly improved. This relational encounter requires mutuality, as an intersubjective connection where both patients and therapists or spiritual care practitioners engage as whole beings. Mutuality moves beyond a one-sided care or clinical authority. It insists that both are present, vulnerable, and affected by the encounter. This is the spiritual dimension of care, one where relational presence becomes a conduit for healing, awakening, and transformation. SIP reinforces this by emphasizing the therapist's ability to engage both the spiritual and psychological realities of the patient, meeting them not only in suffering, but also in the search of meaning, connection, and sacred presence. Through this lens, mutuality becomes both a clinical and a spiritual imperative. Spiritual care is not an act of unilateral support. It is a shared, sacred presence that co-creates meaning, safety, and transformation. SIP further equips therapists to ethically and competently hold this space through spiritual sensitive assessments and interventions, grounded in both theological knowledge and psychotherapeutic practice. To deepen our understanding of the sacred encounter, we now turn to Martin Buber, a key philosophical voice who framed the human encounter as the gateway to the divine. Martin Buber's philosophy of dialogue highlights a distinction between two modes of relating, the I-it and the I-thou. The I-it relation objectifies the other, reducing them to something to be used, analyzed, and controlled. In contrast, the I-thou relation is a reverent meeting, a mutual, present, and holistic recognition of the others as a sacred, living presence. Buber emphasizes that these encounters are not merely psychological interactions, but portals to the eternal thou, the divine, presence that emerges whenever we meet another authentically and wholly. However, Buber was cautious about whether this I-thou relationship could be sustained in professional roles like psychotherapy. He feared that the clinical context, with its hierarchical power dynamics, focus on diagnosis and institutional pressures, would inevitably revert to I-it relation, reducing clients to cases or to problems. His skepticism challenges therapists to critically reflect on their relationship stance and possibilities of transcending the clinical gaze. Yet this caution also invites us as clinical practitioners, as psychotherapists, as spiritual care providers, of how might psychotherapists and spiritual care providers consciously resist the I-it reduction and reclaim the sacredness of the encounter. Then to answer this question, we turn to Carl Rogers, whose optimistic response to Buber's effect offers a therapeutic model rooted in mutuality and presence. So Carl Rogers offers a compelling counterpoint to Buber's skepticism. While deeply influenced by Buber's relational philosophy, Rogers believed that the I-thou encounter were possible and indeed necessary within psychotherapy. His person-centered therapy rests on the conviction that human beings possess an inherent tendency towards growth and actualization when met with certain relational conditions. Rogers identified 3 core therapeutic attributes essential for creating a genuine encounter. So the first is a congruence or authenticity. The therapist's openness and transparency, being real and genuine without hiding behind professional facades. This authenticity fosters trust and invites clients, patients, to do the same, creating a safe space for honest self-exploration. And the second is unconditional positive regard, a non-judgmental, accepting attitude towards the client or the patient's worth and experiences, regardless of what they share. This creates safety and nurtures the client's or the patient's inherent value beyond behaviors and diagnosis. And the third is empathy, deep, accurate attunement to the client's internal experience, communicated with understanding and validation. Empathy bridges the subjective world of therapists and clients, fostering connection and healing. These attributes are not mechanical techniques, but ways of being that creates an environment where the client is encountered as a living thou, rather than an object. Rogers emphasized that healing is relational and mutual. The therapist is not an expert, is not a fixer, but a fellow human who is also changed by the encounter. These core conditions are not theoretical ideas. They come alive in actual moments of sacred connections between therapists or spiritual care practitioners and clients or patients. These moments Carl Rogers himself described as deeply mutual and transformative. Rogers describes moments where usual professional boundaries and roles momentarily dissolve, allowing for authentic mutual presence. In such moments, the therapist and spiritual care practitioners and clients and patients fully meet each other as a person, not as a role or a problem. I argue these experiences verge on the mystical and align very closely with Buber's notion of the eternal thou, when separateness diminishes and a larger shared presence is felt. It is this mutuality, this shared presence and openness that creates the spiritual space in psychotherapy. The spiritual care practitioner does not merely explore a patient's spirituality as an individual phenomenon, but co-creates a shared relational field through genuine encounter. This dynamic mutuality allows both to be touched and transformed by the sacred dimension of the meeting. It is through such mutuality and the sacred enters the room not as a dogma, but as a presence. These sacred moments open not only relational depth, but also spiritual expansion. And to understand the full psychological and existential impact of such encounters, we turn to Abraham Maslow's concept of self-transcendence. Now, Abraham Maslow, best known for his hierarchy of needs, culminating in self-actualization, eventually revised his own theory to include a higher level of self-transcendence. This sixth stage involves moving beyond the self in search of connection with truth, beauty, justice, community, a transcendent reality, what some might call God, a divine, or a higher being. While Maslow identified himself as an atheist, he nonetheless recognized spiritual and peak experiences as essential to the fullness of human life. This demonstrates that the sacred can be a psychological reality without requiring religious belief. Therefore, I argue that Maslow's concept of self-transcendence offers a powerful bridge to Martin Buber's concept of the eternal thou. For Buber, the eternal thou becomes a present when we encounter others not as objects, but as sacred beings. Such moments of true dialogue reveal something greater than the sum of two individuals. They open a relational depth that Buddhists identify as the divine presence. When psychotherapy or spiritual care becomes an I-thou encounter, it also becomes a spiritual space in which self-transcendence can unfold. In other words, the patient is merely actualizing their potential in isolation as a self-actualization, but is drawn beyond themselves towards love, towards truth, and to the sacred presence through the mutuality of the therapeutic relationship. In this encounter with the internal thou, healing is not only psychological, but also spiritual. This insight reframes Maslow's late-stage theory through the lens of Bieber's relational theology, and vice versa. Self-transcendence is no longer only a personal journey. It becomes a relational one. Let us now turn to the spiritual integration of this in a spiritual care context and the importance of spiritual assessment and self-awareness of a spiritual care practitioner. Spirituality and religion, while often conflated, are distinct. Religion generally refers to organized systems of belief, rituals, and community, whereas spirituality relates to the lived experience of meaning, connection, transcendence. Patients may or may not identify with religious traditions, yet still bring spiritual or existential concerns into therapy and conversations. Schlags emphasizes spirituality as a movement towards wholeness, humility, and relational depth, engaging with mystery and the unknown. So spiritual care practitioners must be attuned to these dimensions and create conditions where patients' spiritual concerns can be explored authentically without proselytizing or imposing beliefs. To integrate spirituality meaningfully, the spiritual care practitioner must not only understand these distinctions, but also cultivate an approach that honors each patient's unique path to wholeness. This requires internal work, self-awareness of one's spiritual worldview, and external tools of assessment and engagement. Therefore, effective spiritual integration begins with therapists or spiritual care practitioners' self-awareness of their own biases, own beliefs, and comfort with spiritual topics. Utilizing spiritual assessment, formal protocols like SOAP, in fact, or informal conversational approaches can help uncover patients' spiritual histories, beliefs, and needs. These assessments do more than just gather data. They signal to patients that spirituality is respected and can be part of the therapeutic dialogue. Research supports that clients' and patients' outcomes improve when therapists demonstrate openness to spiritual matters. Spiritual care practitioners, self-awareness and humility are key. Without them, spiritual integration can easily drift into overreach, assumptions, or avoidance. But when the spiritual care practitioner is grounded in their own spiritual dimension and orientation, while remaining open to the patient's meaning-making process, a sacred space can emerge, one that fosters trust, growth, and healing. This sacred relational space is where mutuality is not only possible, but essential, as explored next. So this paper, my research, argues that mutuality is the core mechanism through which spiritual care and psychotherapy becomes transformative. Spiritual care practitioners do not merely explore a patient's spirituality as an individual attribute, but actively co-create a spiritual space through the relationship itself. The space is characterized by mutual presence, openness, and reverence, reflecting Bieber's I-thou and Rogers' core attributes. However, an argument often held by regulatory frameworks such as the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario, CRPO, complicates this picture. According to the CRO, Professional Practice of Jurisprudence for Registered Psychotherapists, within the therapeutic relationship, the client is never truly a mutual participant due to the inherent imbalance of power. This perspective understands mutuality as limited or unachievable in therapy because of the symmetry in roles, knowledge and authority. While this caution reflects important, critical and professional consideration, it may also unduly constrain the potential for spiritual mutuality in a therapeutic encounter. In spiritual care contexts, mutuality can and does occur as a lived relational reality, where power differentials are acknowledged but do not negate the shared sacred presence between practitioner and patient. Therefore, I argue that CRPO and similar regulatory bodies need to re-examine what mutuality means specifically in a spiritual care context, distinguishing it from clinical or legal definitions that prioritize control and authority. Mutuality in spiritual care is less about equal control and more about mutual openness, vulnerability, and recognition of the others as a whole person, including the spiritual essence. It is through this mutual engagement that the sacred relation space is co-created, one that fosters healing, growth, and transformation beyond the limitations imposed by hierarchical structures. Mutuality challenges the traditional clinical symmetry, allowing both patient and therapist or spiritual care practitioner to be fully present and touched by the sacred. I'm going to say that again. Mutuality challenges the traditional clinical symmetry, allowing both patients and spiritual care practitioners to be fully present and touched by the sacred. Such encounter fosters a profound sense of wholeness and meaning that extends beyond the therapy room or the patient's room. They embody the movement towards Maslow's self-transcendence, where the self is both realized and transcend in connection with something greater. In a recent survey among spiritual care practitioners and interns in the hospital that I work, strongly affirm the lived reality of psychotherapy and spiritual care as more than a clinical intervention. They are sacred encounters, characterized by genuine relational depth and mutual presence. 81.8% affirm psychotherapy as more than clinical, seeing it as a sacred encounter. Similar have experienced genuine sacred connections with patients. 100% emphasize empathy, authenticity, and unconditional positive regard as crucial. 90.9% believe therapy fosters self-transcendence and fuller humanness. 72.7% report that patients raise spiritual issues regardless of religious identity. And the same believe it as possible to have a deeply authentic and mutual relationship despite professional boundaries. These findings challenge regulatory perspectives such as those presented by the CRPO, which assert that true mutuality is unattainable in therapy due to power imbalances. While ethical concerns about power dynamics are valid and necessary, the overwhelming practitioner experience documented here suggested that mutuality in the spiritual care and relational sense does exist in practice and is internal to healing. Rather than dismissing mutuality as impossible, regulators might benefit from re-examining the concept within spiritual care contexts, where mutual openness, vulnerability, and sacred presence transcend traditional clinical hierarchies. The data underscores that mutuality is not about equal power or control, about shared humanity and relational presence. It's about co-creating a sacred space that fosters transformation. Ultimately, these survey results provide empirical support for the theoretical framework advanced in the study, that psychotherapy and spiritual care, when authentically integrated, become sites of sacred mutual encounter and self-transcendence, moving beyond clinical interventions in the realm of human and spiritual flourishing. I conclude. This paper proposes that reclaiming the sacred in psychotherapy depends on embracing mutual spiritual presence. Rather than viewing therapy as a unidirectional intervention, this study affirms that sacred, transformative encounters arise when spiritual care practitioners meet patients as whole persons, as a thou, not as a it. Such mutuality opens a space for not only psychological healing, but spiritual becoming. Here lies one of the central insights of this morning. When spiritual care practitioners embody the Rogerian attributes of empathy, authenticity, and unconditional positive regard, they do more than foster a therapeutic alliance. They cultivate the conditions for an I-thou encounter that allows the patient to encounter the eternal thou. This sacred meeting becomes the very movement Maslow describes as self-transcendence, a shift beyond the ego towards the connection with something greater. In this way, I argue that the therapeutic relationship is not just a means to healing, but itself becomes sacred ground. Spiritual care practitioners, in particular, are uniquely situated to embody the sacred mutuality. In their presence, patients are not merely explored or assessed, they are encountered. Through mutuality, spiritual care practitioners co-create a sacred space in which the patient's full humanity and connection to divinity or to something more can be revealed. This is not just care, it is reverence. It is the art of meeting the others in such a way that both are changed and learning more of who they are. To echo Buber's Gottes Finsternis, we are called to reopen the curtains between God and world, between spirit and clinical practice. It is in the I-thou encounter the spiritual care practitioner and patient do not only meet each other, they meet the ultimate thou. And in doing so, they move together towards self-transcendence and fuller humanness. I thank you.